I have an update on David case. Um, I actually have two clips here, and I'm going to start here with the first one.
Wellness knows you love your pet, but not their dumpster breath. Wellness whimsies are the long With the arrest of David's apparent friend, Neil Langston, we took the time to dive a bit more into who he is, the circumstances of his capture, and what his potential role could be in this case. The case of the death of a teenage girl found in the trunk of a car reportedly registered to the romantic homicide singer. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Now, I gotta say this real quick. If you're putting things online, if you're posting clips, if you're in content creation, do you ever wonder how we're able to share so many clips so quickly? We use something called Opus Clip. This is an all-in-one AI editor that makes it so easy to cut, create, and upload videos across any platform. Through AI, Opus Clip generates B-roll, it reframes footage, and it even cleans up audio. And it is so easy. You just visit opus.pro/sidebar, you sign up, you upload, and in minutes you have perfectly edited clips ready to go. For TikTok, Shorts, Reels, Opus Clip is your one-stop shop. And having a tool like Opus Clip means that our producers can get you viral courtroom updates instantly. This is the most powerful tool there is to share ideas and edit like a pro. So go to opus.pro/sidebar to get a free week and then 50% off. Okay, so look, we were in such a rush on Friday with the breaking news of the arrest of David's friend or apparent friend, Neil Langston, that we didn't really get a chance to really discuss everything we know about this guy. And, by the way, his alleged connection to this case, because there was
Okay.
more that came out afterwards. There was more that came out over the weekend. So that's what we want to do right now. Dedicate a little bit more time to Neil Langston, because this is a big deal. This is a big deal. An investigation that was launched after the decomposed body of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez was found in a Tesla out in Los Angeles, reportedly registered to singer David. There hasn't really been a lot that we know, a lot that we can even confirm. There have been no arrests. There have been no charges. And let's be clear about what Langston was arrested for and what he wasn't currently. But this comes, as it was reported, a grand jury may be hearing evidence out in Los Angeles in connection with Celeste's death. And that's interesting because at first we thought that this was an investigative grand jury that would help with getting witness testimony, maybe getting the production of evidence, but they couldn't return an indictment. Then the reporting seemed to suggest, no, this is a grand jury that can return an indictment. So just presuming that for a moment, we got to talk about it. Okay, to be clear, while there have been reports about David's alleged involvement, and that he's considered a suspect, and that he may be facing homicide charges, authorities haven't confirmed that. That's not surprising in a case like this. I just want to make that clear too. But Neil Langston, okay, 23 years old, reported online streamer who apparently has been featured in photos and videos with the romantic homicide singer in the past. He was arrested last week, reportedly on a felony charge of failing to appear as a witness, seemingly out of a case in Los Angeles. That this was a warrant from the LAPD, more specifically, the Robbery Homicide Division that is, in fact, investigating Celeste's death. And we reported that he was arrested out in Montana, more specifically Helena, Montana. This is according to TMZ, that he was booked into the Lewis and Clark County Detention Center at 5:56 p.m. on January 22nd. This is per LA Mag. But now, this is a new piece of information. We have learned that he was apparently apprehended at his mother's house, his mother Cynthia's house, reportedly on Ninth Street, which is apparently a residential neighborhood. Now, LA Mag, Los Angeles Mag, saying that he was wearing a gray hoodie, brown beanie, and navy blue sweats when he was arrested. And you know what's interesting about him allegedly being picked up at his mom's place? I got to call this out. According to TMZ, they say that public records indicate that his mom bought that house in March of 2025. Why is that significant? So while we don't know for sure whether Langston is connected to Celeste's case or not, if he is allegedly involved, and we don't know in what capacity, that timing is important, because if it's true, Celeste apparently disappeared in 2024 from Lake Elsinore, California. And investigators believe that she had been dead for quite some time when she was found in that car on September 8th, 2025. Now, we don't know the exact cause of death, the manner of death, the time of death. Remember, the ME, the medical examiner's records, the office records, are sealed. This is due to a court order that was sought by the LAPD. Remember when the LAPD recently released a statement that said, quote, "We have evidence that David traveled to the Santa Barbara area sometime during the spring of 2025. The reason for that trip is still under investigation, and we've drawn no conclusions at this point about the relevance of the trip to this case." So that house was apparently bought in March of 2025. Now thinking, what else may have happened in spring of 2025? As I mentioned in a previous episode of Sidebar, Steve Fisher, the private investigator who's connected to this case, he says the last proof of life photo they have of Celeste is from January of 2025. So again, timing there is interesting. Well, I want to go back to what has come out since our last report of Neil Langston. So according to LA Mag, his case was handled by the district court, which indicates a felony was at issue here. And according to a service report, a total of 7 police officers were called to his mom's house to arrest him. And also TMZ reporting that while it seems David and Langston appeared together on social media, in the time leading up to when Celeste's body was found,
Right.
Langston allegedly deleted or archived photos of him with David. Again, allegation, something to be thinking about. So based on the reporting, it was speculated, okay, could he have failed to appear as a witness in this apparent ongoing grand jury proceeding that's happening in LA? That's a fair conclusion. And again, potentially a grand jury hearing evidence in the David Celeste case. Now, while the LAPD hasn't come out and said that, there is potentially evidence to support it. Why? The reason we say that is because, as we previously reported per TMZ, that back in December of 2025, there may have been a conversation in the hallway of the courthouse between Deputy District Attorney Beth Silverman, so this is a career homicide prosecutor who is allegedly spearheading the Celeste case, and an attorney named Evan Jennis. Now, Evan Jennis apparently represents Robert Morgenroth, heads up David's touring company, as David's manager. And the conversation
That's a weird conflict of interest.
was about a potentially uncooperative witness. In fact, Silverman allegedly told Jennis that she was going to have the judge issue a body attachment. So this is a legal way to get a witness to appear in front of the court. Now look, we have no idea if this conversation actually happened, or if the alleged uncooperative witness is Neil Langston, but I gotta call it out. I gotta say this, right? So what happened? Well, Langston was transported to Los Angeles. He was booked into the Metropolitan Detention Center. This is per TMZ. And he was released after posting $60,000 bail on Saturday. Now, I will say Steve Fisher, again, he is the private investigator who was hired by the property owner where David was apparently staying at, which was near where that Tesla was found. He posted on X, as a point of clarification, Neil Langston was not booked or housed at the LA Sheriff's Department Twin Towers Jail in Los Angeles. He was extradited and taken to LAPD's Metropolitan Detention Center, different than the federal MDC, and he bonded out from there. The Sheriff's Department is responsible for reporting all prisoners being held in Los Angeles County, which is why he appears on their website. And he also says that he bonded out at 9 a.m. this morning. He's no longer in custody. Now, putting that to the side, if he bonded out $60,000 bail on Saturday, it does become a question.
6 million Jews were murdered. They weren't murdered because they were criminals or did anything wrong, just because they were Jews. My name is Joseph Alexander.
It does become a question of if he will testify and how he will testify, what he would say, what value his potential testimony would be. Because again, assuming he sought to testify in that grand jury, there is something there. Now, I do have to call this out too. When it was being reported that David was being considered a suspect in Celeste's death, there was chatter out there about whether a second suspect was being considered too by authorities. And if that is true, now we got to wonder, is this Langston? Which is interesting because he's being called as a witness, right? He's not a potential person being charged, which, by the way, Steve Fisher, which I'm going to show in a minute, has some thoughts about.
Yeah,
but there's
what
always been
does he know?
speculation that maybe multiple people, multiple actors have been responsible in some way with what happened to Celeste, even just the placement of her body. Now, acclaimed criminal defense attorney Mark Garagos spoke on the Two Angry Men podcast back in November that according to people he apparently spoke to who are connected to the case, investigators may be looking at a newly unidentified second person that was involved, quote, before, during, and after Celeste's death. That they may have digital evidence to support this, cell phone data, social media activity, digital data from the Tesla, and that this evidence places this person in the same Hollywood Hills neighborhood during the time when either Celeste died or her body was found. So again, we don't know for sure what Langston's alleged role is or could be, but got to call that out too if they're talking about maybe a second suspect. Now, let me mention here Steve Fisher, okay? Because Steve Fisher went on X and was quite vocal about this, okay? He's been very outspoken before, but when it came to Neil Langston's arrest, he didn't hold anything back. And by the way, there is evidence that he too may have testified before the grand jury. Anyway, this is what he posted on X. This is Steve Fisher. Quote, "The arrest of Neil Langston for failure to appear to give testimony, which are the exact words used by the sheriff's department when speaking with me, concerns me to a certain extent, assuming this arrest is related to the Celeste Rivas Hernandez case. Targets are not typically called to testify in a case." So basically, this is somebody who may be criminally charged, right? Quote, "At the state level, target letters are not always required, but subpoenaing a target without providing notice is extremely risky. A defense attorney would likely argue that any testimony was coerced."
Uh-oh. Hold on.
Is extremely risky. A defense attorney would likely argue that any testimony was coerced. Had Neil received a target letter, he almost certainly would have retained counsel and invoked his Fifth Amendment rights. You know, right against self-incrimination, which, by the way, he may do if he ends up testifying. Quote, "That makes me think that he's viewed as a witness rather than someone currently at risk of being charged. Did one person act alone in concealing Celeste's body? If this was a homicide, did a single individual act alone without a conspirator? I find that unlikely. This leads me to believe that Neo may represent a last-ditch effort by prosecutors, a Hail Mary of sorts, because they do not yet have what they need to fully make the case. They may be..."
Yeah. And I want to come in and say this too. Anybody who thinks that that this guy did what he did by himself, you would have to be an idiot to not believe that this guy clearly, I do mean clearly, had help disposing of this young lady by the name of Celeste. Well, yeah, I'm gonna call young lady. Only made it to 14 years of life. You know, no proms, stuff like that. And her life, unfortunately, was cut short. It's a tragedy, really. Let's get back into this.
By prosecutors, a Hail Mary of sorts, because they do not yet have what they need to fully make the case. They may be attempting to pressure him into cooperating, potentially by offering immunity. Is Neo the last hope? If that is the situation, it suggests the case is largely circumstantial, which could help explain the prolonged delay. I may be misreading the situation, but when I learned of Neo's arrest, my stomach dropped. I am deeply concerned about both the strength of the case and the pursuit of justice for Celeste. While charging one person is better than charging no one, everyone who bore any culpability in this minor's death or in the concealment of her body should face the most severe punishment available under the law. However, it doesn't feel like that will be the case. Not to me, anyway. Hashtag David, hashtag Celeste Rivas Hernandez. Then Steve follows it up with another X post. Quote, "What I'm most curious about in the Celeste Rivas Hernandez case is what David's reaction or explanation was when it was disclosed on September 8th that a body had been found in a car registered to him. The only people who would know that are those who were on tour with him at the time. I know Neo started the tour with him, but I do not believe he was there for the entire duration. Rob possibly meaning Robert Morgenroth, the manager. Rob likely was involved, but he may not have been on the road continuously or present at every show. Isaiah, however, I believe, was with David the entire time on the road and at each show and was with him the day the news broke. I believe that because Isaiah left her car at the rental house on the day they boarded the tour bus for the first show in San Francisco in July. Her car was not picked up until September 19th, when her father retrieved it late that evening as seen on surveillance. It would be extremely telling to know how those conversations unfolded after it became public that Celeste's body had been found. I am sure there was shock, not about the body itself, because they already knew about that, in my opinion, but about the fact the world was now or knows of what kind of people they are. Who can do this to a 14-year-old or even have knowledge of it and still live with themselves? Months later, and not even a single offer of condolences to Celeste's family and friends from any of them. Nobody has ever been convicted of a crime by offering a condolence. And if people are offered immunity, it doesn't mean they're not guilty. It means they got lucky. But karma does not care about luck. To be clear, I am sick and bleeping tired of each day that goes by that those responsible are not behind bars.
Right.
It's time to bleeping pay for what you or each of you did. Now, it is a very interesting take from Steve regarding Langston and others, and if he was allegedly involved or not, and whether or not a deal needs to be worked out, the strength of the case, and the target of the investigation is obviously very different than a witness. We don't really know what authorities are looking at, even if there is fully a grand jury that's been impaneled, what they're looking at. But, you do wonder if this case does need to be built up on witness testimony, and whether or not there's somebody else that hasn't been identified that potentially Neo can provide testimony to. So perhaps it is David, perhaps it's David and someone else. Is it just Neo and David? This is what we don't know, and obviously you can sense Steve's frustrations if Neo was, in his view, or maybe in his view, is a central role in this and is not going to be charged, but we just don't know for sure. Because if he was to be indicted too, Steve does make a point, they wouldn't really be bringing him back to testify as a witness. And it does raise interesting questions, but once more, we don't even know the exact circumstances or Langston's connection to David or Celeste for sure. And you know what else? Authorities never even confirmed what the relationship was between Celeste and David. There's always been speculation that the two were romantically involved, despite her being a minor. And we always
but
talk
they
about
never
the charges
confirmed
related
it.
to a potential homicide.
It
or
looks like
body.
it, but they
If
never
there was
confirmed
an
it.
inappropriate relationship going on,
It was
and she's a
never
minor,
set in
those are potential
stone.
charges too. By the way, we made a contact with a Montana police officer who indicated, quote, for further information regarding the investigation, please contact the Los Angeles Police Department Robbery Homicide Division. So there you go. Again, another confirmation that that specific division of LAPD.
Come on. Come on.
Involved in the arrest of Neil Langston. But with all that in mind, now I want to go to something else. I want to go to my interview with retired Detective Commander Will Svilar. So this is from Friday. This is when the news broke of Neil Langston's arrest. It provides a little bit more context to think about in terms of his potential role, his arrest, what we can expect. Here you go.
Sounds to me like, 2 and 2, like you said, the grand jury's been convened since November. What happens then is the prosecution is presenting witness after witness, putting evidence in against a specific targets for a specific charge. So bringing this guy in, they probably believe has pertinent information to support this charge. And it sounds to me like the noose is starting to tighten around the offender.
If we assume that he was supposed to be testifying in front of the grand jury, and obviously we know grand juries are kind of one-sided, it's the prosecution presenting enough evidence to suggest, hey, can you return an indictment? First we had thought that it was just an investigative grand jury that couldn't return an indictment. Then there was reporting, no, this is a grand jury that can return an indictment. The standard to get back an indictment is relatively low, but it's the prosecution's case. They're presenting evidence to support whatever charges they're looking for here. If we assume he's been an uncooperative witness, and we assume he's all the way in Montana, so 1,200 miles away, timeline's interesting, right? So the reporting in December of an uncooperative witness, and now in January, I wonder if they might have had trouble finding him. I don't know the circumstances of his arrest. I don't know the talk to me about the cooperation. If you have
talk
LAPD
about it.
now working with Montana to maybe find him, I do wonder, was there an issue to figure out where he was?
Sure, it could have taken a while to find him, but once you swear out a warrant and you put a warrant across the database, across the country, anywhere this guy gets stopped, it's serviceable. As long as it's a good warrant, it's serviceable, and there's extradition involved, it gets served wherever he is. And you get it out there across law enforcement channels. You put it into leads. Once it's in leads, every law enforcement agency has it. So regardless of where he went, he was eventually going to get caught. Now, they may have had some information from whatever sources that he was up in Montana, but this could be as simple as a routine traffic stop where he gets picked up on a name check.
What do you think his connection is to this case?
Well, he's a friend. He's an influencer. I think the purpose of the grand jury is to try to find out what that connection is. And again, there's so many different things out there with these influencers and the YouTube. I don't know what his connection would be, but the grand jury wants to find out, and then prosecution wants to find out. And again, now you can bring him back, extradite him, make him go to the grand jury, but he can still take the fifth. He doesn't have to testify. If it comes back, the medical examiner comes back that this is a homicide, changes everything. If it's a homicide, now you're looking at a murder charge. This grand jury is being presented information and evidence to support a specific charge against a specific person or persons. Could this guy be part of it? He could be, or he could just be a witness. Now, the benefit of bringing him in, if he decides he doesn't want to testify, he wants to take the fifth, well, then the judge can make him sit. The judge who issues a warrant can make him sit in jail. And, up to 30 days, you might change your mind.
There's the possibility, when you think about what happened to Celeste, whether or not multiple people can be involved. Do you think that this is a grand jury that is hearing evidence against multiple people, and there would be multiple indictments or indictment containing multiple defendants at the same time?
Absolutely, could well be. And I can tell you, like you mentioned earlier, the threshold to get an indictment, to get probable cause to indict it, to move it on to trial, to the next phase, isn't that high. Okay, it's like probable cause. But if you're bringing all these witnesses, you're laying out a pretty complex complaint, or a complex argument that possibly there could be more than one person. Matter of fact, I'd be surprised if there was only one person.
By the way, just to go back to Neil Langston, if someone is allegedly uncooperative, does that mean they have something to hide? Or have you seen in your experience, maybe they don't want to testify for a variety of reasons?
Both ways. Either someone's got something to hide, or and more often than not, when we get reluctant witnesses, and I 32 years on a job, I worked murders and violent crimes for 25 of them. Most of the time, in those instances where we can't get someone to cooperate, it's because out of fear. Their fear of retribution, and they don't want to get themselves involved or their families involved.
By the way, did you see this mugshot of him? We have it. Did you see it? Where
he looks pretty
smiling. That was weird.
Yeah, he looks like he's in a good mood.
Yeah.
Weird.
That was interesting, just to say the least. I mean,
I did see that.
Yeah,
but also think about how young they are. I mean, you talk about 23-year-olds.
Weird.
What's David, 20 years old? These are young people that investigators might be looking at. I think and that's, by the way, something else that everybody talks about. They say if they're looking at David, it's not just in connection with the death of Celeste, but any alleged relationship he had with her. Do you think that's being explored?
Sure. Absolutely. There's ages of consent. She's below the age of consent. He's over the age of consent. That's an inappropriate relationship.
Right.
And not only inappropriate, but illegal. So
very damn illegal.
The indictments and the charges, that could very well be part of it.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay,
and
here's the
please
second
subscribe on
clip.
YouTube. An American citizen is shot by Border Patrol agents in Minneapolis in another disputed circumstance. And with all the new developments in the David investigation, possibly connected to the death of a 14-year-old girl found in his car, Celeste Rivas Hernandez, it is time to analyze all the major potential pieces of evidence, from the alleged friend who just got arrested to a possible burn cage to the car. We're diving into it all right now. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. All right, before we go into this disturbing story, you want to talk about what's disturbing? Did you know that a total stranger can just find and use anything about your private life? Yeah, your name, your phone number, your address, it's all out there online, which is why I want everybody out there who follows Sidebar, keep your data safe online. Our sponsor, Incogni, will track down all of those old posts and search sites that are exposing your information and then demand its removal. Look, I was shocked. Turns out databases had all my information, and within days, Incogni was taking them all down. The setup is simple. You just create an account. Incogni is going to do the rest. Plus, their new Unlimited Plans custom removals feature lets you submit specific links that their privacy experts will then personally investigate and remove. So if you care about with all the new developments in the David investigation, possibly connected to the death of a 14-year-old girl found in his car, Celeste Rivas, Incogni was taking them. this case. If prosecutors are in fact building a case against someone or several people, either for the death of Celeste or the disposal of her body, or maybe both, maybe also this alleged connection between David and Celeste, what evidence is there? There's been a lot of reporting, but what is the evidence? Now, to be clear, this is based on the reporting that we've seen in public statements. We don't know for sure what the evidence is, but we kind of have a pretty good idea. I mean, there is very little that has been said officially, and to be clear also, neither David nor anyone has been officially arrested or charged in connection with Celeste's death. It hasn't been even confirmed by authorities that he is in fact a suspect or is being considered for homicide charges. And as we discussed on other sidebars, one of David's alleged associates or friends, Neil Langston, was arrested out in Montana for reportedly failing to appear as a witness. Apparently brought back to Los Angeles. There was speculation that he was uncooperative. He was an uncooperative witness in the possible Los Angeles grand jury hearing evidence, but we don't know for sure. But between him, David's manager may be testifying, Celeste's body, this potential burn cage, the car, a Santa Barbara trip, surveillance footage, a title transfer, the place David was apparently staying at, we have built up over the last several weeks a collection of potential evidence to analyze. So let's dig into it. I'm not going to do it alone. Let me bring on criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, Safa Robinson-Ferrer, back on to Sidebar. Safa, good to see you. Thanks for taking the time.
Hey, Jesse, good to see you.
Okay, so first let me ask you your take on the arrest of Neil Langston. So assuming he was in fact brought back to testify in front of a Los Angeles grand jury, what do you think the value of his testimony would be?
I think it's going to have significant value, and it speaks to the fact that he was arrested for at least what we believe is failing to appear or failing to testify before the grand jury. In the legal world, we call him a material witness, that he's going to provide some sort of material fact that would essentially bring about an indictment and or a conviction at a trial against any suspect. And it's speculating here, David, the individual that has been a suspect for quite some time. So it's not a surprise that he has been arrested, and it's not a surprise that he may have some information. We believe that he's been a very close friend to David, and so he may very well have more intimate details about David's relationship with Celeste, may have been around her, may have some information that would lead law enforcement to believe that he could have had some very direct knowledge of how she was ultimately murdered, or even been a participant.
And before I get into Steve Fisher, who's the private investigator that's been involved in this case, he has some thoughts on Neil Langston that I definitely want your take on. Isn't it possible that if Neil Langston was being brought back to testify in front of the grand jury, he could plead the fifth? And would he plead the fifth in front of the grand jury?
He can certainly plead the fifth, and that's his right against self-incrimination. What would be very smart for him to do is to ensure that he has counsel before he goes in and testifies, and certainly now he's facing criminal charges, and so he's going to need counsel to represent him regardless. That attorney would be able to sort of have a conversation with the district attorney's office about what information he is willing to give or is not willing to give, or what testimony he's willing to testify to in the grand jury.
Let me get your take on what Steve Fisher said. So again, Steve is somebody we've had on Sidebar before. He is the private investigator who was hired by the property owner where David was apparently staying at the Hollywood Hills. This is near where the Tesla was found. And he posted this first. There's two messages. First, this is what he posted after Langston's arrest. Quote, "The arrest of Neil Langston for failure to appear to give testimony," which are the exact words used by the sheriff's department when speaking with me, "concerns me to a certain extent, assuming this arrest is related to the Celeste Rivas Hernandez case. Targets are not typically called to testify in a case. At the state level, target letters are not always required, but subpoenaing a target without providing notice is extremely risky. A defense attorney would likely argue that any testimony was coerced. Had Neo received a target letter, he almost certainly would have retained counsel and invoked his Fifth Amendment rights. That makes me think that he's viewed as a witness rather than someone currently at risk of being charged. Did one person act alone in concealing Celeste's body? If this was a homicide, did a single individual act alone without a conspirator? I find that unlikely. This leads me to believe that Neo may represent a last-ditch effort by prosecutors, a Hail Mary of sorts, because they do not yet have what they need to fully make the case. They may be attempting to pressure him into cooperating, potentially by offering immunity. Is Neo the last hope? If that is the situation, it suggests the case is largely circumstantial, which could help explain the prolonged delay. I may be misreading the situation, but when I learned of Neo's arrest, my stomach dropped. I am deeply concerned about both the strength of the case and the pursuit of justice for Celeste. While charging one person is better than charging no one, everyone who bore any culpability in this minor's death or in the concealment of her body should face the most severe punishment available under the law. However, it doesn't feel like that will be the case. Not to me anyway. Hashtag David, hashtag Celeste Rivas Hernandez. And then he follows it up with another ex-post. Quote, what I am most curious about in the Celeste Rivas Hernandez case is what David's reaction or explanation was when it was disclosed on September 8th that a body had been found in a car registered to him. The only people who would know are those who were on tour with him at the time. I know Neo started the tour with him, but I do not believe he was there for the entire duration. Rob, probably Robert Morgenroth, his manager, we'll talk more about, Rob likely was involved, but he may not have been on the road continuously or present at every show. Isia, however, I believe, was with David the entire time on the road and at each show and was with him the day the news broke. And by the way, I think Isia could be possibly Isia Collins, who's maybe a streamer of some kind, maybe a performer. There has been talk about whether or not there was a connection to David, but let's keep going. I believe that because Isia left her car at the rental house on the day they boarded the tour bus for the first show in San Francisco in July. Her car was not picked up until September 19th when her father retrieved it late that evening as seen on surveillance. It would be extremely telling to know how those conversations unfolded after it became public that Celeste's body had been found. I am sure there was shock, not about the body itself because they already knew about that, in my opinion, but about the fact that the world was now or knowing of what kind of people they are. Who can do this to a 14-year-old or even have knowledge of it and still live with themselves? Months later, and not even a single offer of condolences to Celeste's family and friends from any of them. Nobody has ever been convicted of a crime by offering a condolence. And if people are offered immunity, it doesn't mean they're not guilty. It means they got lucky. But karma does not care about luck. To be clear, I am sick and bleeping tired of each day that goes by that those responsible are not behind bars. It's time to bleep and pay for what you or each of you did. So, Safa, quite the statements there from Steve Fisher. But I guess, his main complaint is, why hasn't there been an arrest? Why hasn't there been a charge? Is this the last-ditch effort to go with Neo? Because it seems that he's suggesting this is somebody who could have been brought up on charges as well. Is the government trying to make a deal here? I mean, why is this person being called as a potential witness?
Wellness knows you love your pet. A lot. Like daily face kisses, no personal space. A lot. What you don't love is their breath. Their hot shrimp, wavy green lines, literal dumpster stinking breath. Wellness Whimsies are the long-lasting daily dental.
Who could have been brought up on charges as well. Is the government trying to make a deal here? I mean, why is this person being called as a potential witness if all of the reporting is true?
So there's a few things to unpack here, and I think the first thing that we have to look at is, with respect to grand jury proceedings, those are secret and confidential. So I don't think that we have enough information to speculate as to the specific evidence that is going to be entered into grand jury through those witnesses. Now, I think the question is whether or not there could be one or more individuals that are charged with Celeste's murder. And so a part of what has to be proven is the identity of the person who has committed that crime or identities of individuals. So with respect to Neo or Mr. Langston, there is a question here, and of course, we're just speculating as to whether or not he had any level of involvement in the actual murder. There's question of how long he had been with David on tour. There was his absence from the tour at a certain point in time. And so we would want to know ultimately if that coincides with the time of her murder, which would also be information that will likely be presented to the grand jury to bring about an indictment. We're not going to see an arrest unless there is an indictment by the grand jury. And so what I think Mr. Langston's role is here is likely that they want him to cooperate and testify against David. My speculation would be that David is their suspect, considering that he's the one that had an intimate relationship with Celeste. Ultimately, something occurred that resulted in her death. He may have had other individuals that participated in the concealment of her body, but we don't know that as of yet. And all of these things are alleged. We're just speculating.
I guess his concern is right, like he's thinking it's either, it can't just be David, it has to be multiple people. Because, by the way, Mark Garagos, the claimed attorney, once made the point that people he spoke to, in this case, believe there is a second person that authorities were looking at using social media activity, cell phone data, the Tesla digital data there, but to track this person. I don't know if it's Neo, I don't know if it's somebody else, but you're saying, I mean, it is possible that there could be somebody else we don't know, unidentified, that may be involved in this. It's not just put all the focus, like it's just Neo and David, there could be more.
That is absolutely a possibility. And if we're going with that there was more than one individual that is ultimately a suspect in this case. Let's use Mr. Langston as an example, that he is the other individual that could be responsible. That is where the immunity may come into play if he's going to testify in grand jury. Not only that, but we also do have to deal with the fact that if he's not going to receive immunity, but he's been subpoenaed as a material witness, what information can he provide that would ultimately satisfy the prosecution, but also prevent him from incriminating himself from anything further? So that's where his attorney is going to come into play and ultimately have a conversation with the district attorney to say, this is what he will testify to, and this is what he will not testify to. And if he doesn't want to testify, he certainly doesn't have to, but we now know that he has been arrested for ultimately not coming to testify. Right. And so that's going to be something that he's going to have to deal with, unfortunately, as this case continues to proceed. And maybe there won't be an indictment without his testimony. So that would explain that last-ditch effort to have him come in and testify. But because there may be some culpability there, he has to be very careful with what he's going to present forward.
By the way, Steve Fisher maybe testified in front of the grand jury, too. This was based on his ex-post, reading between the lines of what he said to us on Sidebar. If that is true, why would he have testified? What evidence do you think he can share that would be of value to prosecutors?
It seems that Mr. Fisher does have a significant amount of information, or probably has a little bit more intimate details with respect to what the allegations are. And so he may be able to provide information with respect to any alleged suspect and where they have been located at the time or on or around the time where Celeste was murdered, who was on tour with David, at what point did they leave or return, what David's location was at that time. Not only that, but if we're talking about the area where the vehicle was located or in Hollywood Hills, then he may have some jurisdictional information there that would be provided to law enforcement to ultimately bring about an indictment and sort of just tie in the loose ends. He certainly could be used for that.
And as I mentioned, he's looking at that house that David was apparently staying at in the Hollywood Hills. And if you think back to that, again, this is again back when Celeste's body was found on September 8th, authorities afterwards executed a search warrant at that property, reportedly took evidence, like maybe even a computer. It was also reported that David had broken the lease, that he moved this stuff out. Talk to me about what evidence you think they gathered potentially from that house and how it was processed.
You know, there's a number of things that could be ultimately retrieved as evidence, you know, if that is the suspected location of the homicide.
And just to push back a little bit, when we spoke to Steve, he indicated there was nothing in there that she was killed or died there. But I don't know if investigators found something else that he didn't. I don't know for sure, but just giving everybody a little context there.
Sure. So ultimately, what could have been located is, particularly if David was staying there, would be, you know, maybe some sort of DNA evidence. His clothing could have been clothing or anything that he may have had on at the alleged time of the incident. Again, if we're going under the assumption that he is the suspect. So certain DNA evidence that could be obtained from the clothing. If a computer was taken, then there's certain digital forensic evidence that could be on those drives that law enforcement could ultimately pull. So if there's a certain manner of death that's determined and we see that there is information on that hard drive that is consistent with the manner of death, or for an example, how to conceal a body and things like that, then that certainly is circumstantial evidence that would elevate and likely point to that individual, David, or somebody else at that location or who had access to that laptop or computer committing that alleged crime. Also video footage, assuming that there may have been ring camera footage, we can narrow down the time that the vehicle had left, the last time the vehicle was at that location, if it ever returned, was Celeste ever at that location? So there's a lot of things that could possibly be taken in as evidence. And also we, again, don't know the manner of death specifically, but if there is something that would appear to be a murder weapon that does have Celeste DNA on it, then that certainly could be something that is retrieved.
Legal AI won't create competitive advantage. I've heard a lot of people say that legal AI won't create competitive advantage. That when everyone has it, everyone has the same outcome. That's rubbish.
Come on.
I spent years believing I was nothing more than the damage I left behind. Trained as an assassin.
On it, then that certainly could be something that is retrieved.
And there's something interesting you mentioned about the computer, right? So maybe a computer would have purchase history, things that you were looking at. I'll talk about that in a second. But there's been a lot of talk about what David's relationship was with Celeste. It hasn't been confirmed by authorities, but there's been speculation that there was a romantic relationship and she's a minor. You think they're looking at that computer for any evidence to support that? And if that's the case, then you're talking about potential charges that don't even have to deal with murder or the concealment of a body.
Absolutely. And say, for example, this computer is a MacBook, so, for example, and with the MacBook, it's typically tied to all of the devices like iPhones and things like that. They're going to be able to see if there are any photos between David and Celeste in that computer or in those devices that would ultimately indicate that they did, in fact, have a romantic relationship, or what the nature of their relationships were. Also, we're looking at, or possibly able to view, text messages, what the text message thread between David and Celeste was, the conversations they were having, the level of intimacy that they had or did not have at the time that they were engaged in some sort of relationship. So all of those things will come into play. Another interesting thing is that with respect to Mr. Langston, it's going to be interesting to see now that he's been taken into custody. If he was taken into custody with his phone, for example, then that's going to likely be held by law enforcement, and they can go and get a warrant in order to dump the phone, so to speak, or to extract evidence from that phone. So, and ultimately, if David comes into custody as well, any devices that he has on, and I've seen it time and time again, where law enforcement will issue or attempt to get a warrant so that they can extract the contents of those phones. So I think that the devices, whether it's the computer or phones, that ultimately may come into play, will provide critical evidence.
And I mentioned if you go on the computer, right, there could be evidence of purchases. This is something that's come up a lot, the burn cage, this alleged bird cage. This was something that came forward from, again, Steve Fisher. So I go back to an ex-post that he had where he goes, although my words have been misquoted by some, what I actually said about certain items found at the Doheny address was that they were, quote, items you would expect to find on a farm rather than in a home in the Hollywood Hills. One of those items was a burn cage incinerator, advertised to burn at 1600 degrees. Human cremations are typically performed at approximately 1400 degrees. An incinerator is not legal to use within city limits and serves no legitimate purpose at a residential property in the Hollywood Hills. Some will argue that this item was intended as a prop for a video. If that were the case, it raises several obvious questions. Why would a 55-pound burn cage be delivered to a private residence instead of directly to a prop designer or production house? Why would it be ordered before departing on an extended world tour? And why was it never used in any video production? It is also important to note that there were additional items present that could be used in conjunction with the burn cage. To be very clear, this burn cage was not used. It was still new and in the box. However, given that Celeste Rivas Hernandez's remains were ultimately found in the Tesla trunk, the presence of an incinerator at the same residence associated with that vehicle necessarily raises questions about intent. The burn cage was not taken during the search warrant, and because it was not used, it appears it's not of importance to any possible criminal investigation. But we think it's important context, even if not criminal. The burn cage and other related items were delivered to the residence under a false name, although the deliveries were accepted at the property. Attached is a photograph of the actual burn cage incinerator as found at the residence, along with an image from Dr. Burns' advertising materials for the product. Hashtag Celeste Rivas Hernandez, hashtag David. Now, Safa, again, just taking his word, I mean, maybe it wasn't taken into evidence. Maybe it was, I can't say. But that feels like an important piece of evidence in this case to establish, I would imagine, there was an intent to get rid of a body, right? We don't know for sure, but, they might have an alternative explanation why that's delivered. But to me, do you think that's actually going to be a piece of evidence in this case or not?
It certainly could be. It gives me pause because it ultimately was not taken in as evidence when there was that search warrant that was executed. And I think the prosecution is going to have to be very careful with how they play this. And again, a lot of it goes to information that we don't know at this time, which is the condition of the body, what it appeared to look like at the time that it was recovered, and what injuries Celeste had sustained, and ultimately a manner of death. I don't know that or think that there's any indication that she was burned, and it appears that there was no use of this burn cage specifically. And so what's going to happen is ultimately it could come up, but if the prosecution, it doesn't feel or believe that it is consistent with her manner of death, that might be something that they want to stay away from, because they have to present things that are going to really show that this prosecution is credible, that it's truthful and correct, and that they have the right identity of the individual or individuals involved, and that the manner of death is truly specific to how Celeste was ultimately murdered. And if there's no indication that she was burned in that burn cage, then it may not be as relevant as we would speculate that it was. It's a very odd thing to have, especially delivered at a home and things like that, but we don't know for sure. And if we don't know for sure, then we've really got to be careful with how we use that and if that is enough circumstantial evidence of any crime. And right now, it doesn't seem, at least based on the evidence that we've heard, that that was a part of any crime. So we don't know as of yet. It could come into play. And I think that this case is heavily relying on circumstantial evidence. So how the prosecution is going to attempt to tie and weave everything together against David, if he is the suspect, and anybody else from his camp that ultimately could be charged with Celeste's murder, is going to be very interesting. But they've got to really piecemeal key pieces of evidence and how they were used in the manner they were used, ultimately leading to her death in the way that she passed away.
President Trump restored law and order, and South Carolina's next attorney general must stand with him. Only one candidate has the experience and the conservative record to make it happen. Solicitor David Stumbo, with over 2 decades as a prosecutor.
About pieces of evidence. What about the Tesla? Right, it was found her body was found in the front trunk after it was taken to a tow yard. Decomposed remains there. Reportedly, it was abandoned in the Hollywood Hills. There was reporting that it was parked there for maybe over a month. What information can the Tesla provide? Because Tesla's a very unique car too.
Absolutely. So there's a few things that we can look at with the Tesla. First and foremost, because that is the location where her body was recovered, we're looking at DNA evidence. Her DNA evidence, any other DNA or fingerprint evidence that may have been in that vehicle to show who would have been in that vehicle, who was driving that vehicle, if there's any fingerprints, hair follicles, things of that nature. Also, if there's evidence of a crime taking place in that vehicle. So we, at this point in time, don't know specifically how she was murdered, but she could have possibly been murdered in that vehicle. And if there is any indication or evidence that points to that act occurring in that vehicle, that would certainly be evidence. Now, the uniqueness of a Tesla, most of us know that there are a ton of cameras on and around Teslas. So what would be able to happen is there could be a subpoena to Tesla for the video footage that would have captured the incident on the date and time, or alleged date and time. It would also capture if Celeste was in that vehicle or entered that vehicle while she was alive, who was the driver of that vehicle, if anything occurred inside that vehicle. It may not capture a specific graphic of the event, but ultimately may provide some information if there was a murder that occurred there. Not only that, but if her body was placed in the front trunk, I do believe, and I'm not totally for certain, but I do believe that there are some front cameras along the bumper of Teslas. And so that may capture her body being placed in that trunk as well, which ultimately could be used by law enforcement.
And it's like a computer, right? It has digital tracking information too, which will be key. Okay, by the way, we've been talking about it so much. Celeste's body. Okay, in any case, the body is itself has a ton of answers, has a ton of clues. But the problem here is there was a hold that was placed on anything coming out of the ME's office. The LAPD got a court order, so we don't know the cause, the manner of death. Reports like toxicology, those reports are sealed. Law enforcement basically said it's to preserve the integrity of the investigation. Even so, how much can Celeste Rivas Hernandez's body reveal about what happened to her, when it happened to her, and who might have done something to her?
In terms of decomposition, I think that they'll be able to name at least a time frame as to when she entered postmortem. Not only that, but the manner of death, the condition of her body. So if there appears to be a break along the neck area, then we know that there may have been some strangulation. Ultimately, if her body is still intact enough to show whether she has defensive wounds, there could be an indication that whatever ultimately happened, she fought back. It just depends on the condition of the body. You're also thinking about it being in a trunk. It's California, so the temperatures at the time, being concealed in a specific space for quite some time. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the toxicology report ultimately comes back. We may not have all of the answers that we're looking for, but I think that there will be certain key pieces of evidence. Again, for example, if there's a neck break, if it's intact enough to show defensive wounds, any type of toxicology that may still be left in the body, whether that be any type of drug or anything of that nature that would indicate there was a substance entered into your body. You know, all of those things may come into play, and there may be enough to have some of that once the toxicology or the medical exam is performed. And I'm sure it probably has been at this point. But again, as we know, they've kept that tightly under wraps.
And going back to where we started with the grand jury, again, this is all centered about if they are hearing evidence and if there are a grand jury that's impaneled to return an indictment, because there's sometimes grand juries that just, further an investigation, but assuming it's one that can return an indictment. You talk about evidence, you talk about testimony. I think it was TMZ who first reported that David's manager and the president of his touring company, Robert Morgenroth, maybe spoke in front of the grand jury, testified, because it was alleged in the courthouse hallway, he was overheard telling his lawyer that the prosecutor, so possibly Deputy DA Beth Silverman, who's a career prosecutor, was, quote, very pushy on why I didn't call police. I said I feel like I didn't have the responsibility to do that and just wanted to continue with the tour. By the way, David was on tour when Celeste's body was found. That was a tour that was canceled. We haven't seen David since. We talked about Neo, right? Now you talk about Robert Morgenroth. Value of his testimony, value of the evidence he has?
The value of the evidence may not be as significant as Neo or as David's testimony would be himself if he ultimately decided to testify in grand jury, which I don't think is going to be a thing. But he will likely be able to establish a timeline of events in conjunction with the time of Celeste's murder. So again, I don't know the exact date or time that they're alleging she was murdered, but his tour manager would be able to testify as to where David was at that time, who else was there on tour at that time, the location that they were located at, if anybody entered or left, or what specifically he saw. And sometimes with grand jury testimony too, the prosecutors just like to get as much evidence as they can. Not all of it may be relevant, but all of it typically will at least establish some elements of the offense that they intend to charge and the identity of the individuals that they plan to charge.
A couple more pieces of evidence I have to ask you about. You mentioned timeline, right? When she died. We don't know exactly, but this is an interesting timeline because we believe that she disappeared from Lake Elsinore in 2024. There was surveillance footage from, I believe, March 2024 that was released. It was taken from a local liquor shop in that area. She apparently lived nearby. It seemingly captures her walking, then jogging down a street. She disappears from view. We thought that might be the last footage, but then TMZ obtained footage of what appears to be Celeste in September of 2024. And in this footage that was captured on Nest camera on September 8th, 2024, so a year before her body was found, she's seen having some sort of conversation with neighbors, reportedly over a prank that was pulled on her parents' home, potentially a ding-dong ditch, not entirely sure. And TMZ reported that there was maybe some racial slurs that may have been asserted in this altercation. So you see that footage. And then Steve Fisher indicated that the last known photograph, proof of life, that he has of Celeste was January 2025. And then you couple that with LAPD releasing a statement that, quote, we have evidence that David traveled to the Santa Barbara area sometime during the spring of 2025. The reason for that trip is still under investigation, and we've drawn no conclusions at this point about the relevance of the trip to this case. Again, couple that with the idea of how long was she in that Tesla. I also have to say, I think it's interesting that Neil Langston, the house where he was arrested, his mom's house, apparently she bought that house in March of 2025. So if we're trying to set up a timeline here of what happened to Celeste Safa, what do you think the relevance is? What are you taking away from the evidentiary value of that timeline?
Come on.
Hey guys, welcome home! Where creativity is only limited by what you can dream of.
Timeline.
Absolutely. So what we know, at least if there's that last proof of life video from January 2025, we know that her body was recovered in September of 2025. That in-between time frame, which indicates that, she may have still been alive for some time, but there might be evidence that David came to the area that she was located in, at least maybe in March. She still could have been alive at that point in time. I think that there was evidence that she had been deceased for at least a month before her body was recovered. And so one of the things that will have to happen is that law enforcement's going to investigate if there's any indication that she was still alive in those in-between months of January to maybe July or August. If there's a footprint of her online or social media that is true and accurate to the time that, say, for example, she posted something on social media in June of 2025, then we can narrow it. And if it's properly authenticated as her being alive and at that specific date and time, then we know we can narrow the timeline as to when she was actually possibly murdered. And again, if we're looking at timeline and David being on tour, other individuals being involved, what the prosecution's going to do is narrow it down as precise as possible. And they may say something to the effect of, on or around August 1st, 2025, or between these dates to these dates, we believe that Celeste Rivas was murdered by this sort of manner by this individual. And so as long as the timeline adds up who may have been available or present to commit that crime during that time frame, then the prosecution is going to narrow it as best as they can. And it may not be precise, but they will attempt to do it as best as they can.
Safa, one more piece that I got to talk to you about, this title transfer. It was reported that David had transferred ownership of one of his Texas homes to his mom's name at the same time that Celeste's body was released to her family. This is according to ABC6. Two ways to look at that, right? One, something shady's going on. Or B, maybe he had a feeling he was going to be arrested and indicted and wanted to transfer ownership for financial reasons. Could be 100% innocent, or maybe just coincidental. I don't know.
I don't think there's often such a thing as coincidence. I think that, would certainly indicate to me or anybody in our profession that there could be some sort of reason behind him doing that. And ultimately, one could be ownership. If law enforcement is looking at that location as having any key pieces of evidence to the crime, who has the ability to consent to the search of that home, or ultimately if law enforcement were to get a warrant, we now know that that home is no longer titled and owned by him, so he doesn't have that possessory interest in that home. Also, the idea is, maybe once we knew that ultimately she passed away, that maybe there would be some criminal action, of course, and we know that that is the case, that may be pending, or also civil action that may be pending. So if he's expecting that maybe her family will come after him in civil court, maybe for a wrongful death suit, he wants to get these items out of his name to protect his assets, which he actually can't do, but that could be a possibility.
Safa Robinson Ferrer, thank you so much for coming on. Really, really appreciate you breaking down all this potential evidence in this case. Thank you. Great seeing you.
Thanks, Jesse.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you.
And that is it for the update on David. Okay, with that being said, I'm done. Good night. Peace.